So then I left you with something to think about, right? The question was, is the mundane world worth it? Is it okay? Is it worth it for the limited amount of temporary, short-term happiness that I experience, that there should be so much suffering? Now, if you've stuck with me up to this point, then I assume that means that you have doubts about this, whether or not it is worth it, all the trouble we have to go through in the mundane world for our limited experiences of happiness. But let's face it, you're not alone. Human beings have been thinking about this for countless centuries. And because of that, then they've turned to the spiritual path. They've looked for some way to overcome their suffering. Now, it's not like overcoming personal suffering is an incredibly high motivation, but it's a starting point, right? So then in general, when it comes to the spiritual path, there are various methods or techniques to help one overcome suffering. And I'd have to say one of the foundational techniques is acceptance. And this is something that's present in pretty well every religion. I suppose it's present everywhere, is acceptance. And there's different levels of approaching this question of how I come to accept the suffering of the mundane world. So the first question is, well, what is the importance of acceptance? And that's because if we can accept our suffering, then it greatly reduces the intensity of that suffering. Now, in general, then the spiritual path is classified in terms of tantras. That's how it's taught in the Buddha Dharma, and this comes from the Indian tradition. But just because it's an Eastern tradition doesn't mean it doesn't apply. For example, to the Semitic or Abrahamic religions, such as Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc. So here I'm going to suggest that the Christian practices, etc., fall within this category of the outer tantras. Of course, that's not a direct correlation, but it's in terms of classifying spiritual practice. So I'll just get to the point because you're not going to understand what I'm talking about. We're talking about acceptance, right? So by accepting our suffering, then we greatly reduce that suffering. And so there's different techniques to help us to accept our suffering. And in the theistic religions, then this is primarily in the form of accepting the role of God in the universe. We say that everything comes down to God. It's all the will of the Creator. And when you have a belief in this, this helps you greatly to accept your mundane suffering, the troubles that you experience. Not only that, but it stops us from making these experiences of suffering worse. What do I mean by that? Well, if somebody wrongs you, does something horrible to you, and for example, as in the Hindu tradition, we say, well, this must be the will of God. And because of that, because accepting that it was God's will that you should be wronged by this individual, then you don't get angry and you don't lash out at them. You can see that this will make things better. It won't make it worse, right? You may have suffered from his actions or her actions, but by not getting angry, not fighting back or seeking revenge, then the problem does not grow. It does not propagate, it doesn't get worse. Now, I think this is a really wonderful aspect of the Hindu tradition and also Christianity, etc. Because what we need in order to deal with our suffering and our trauma, essentially, is to accept it. For example, if I experience some trauma early in my life and I can't let go of that, then it will continue to plague me and cause me trouble throughout my life. It's only once I accept that this has happened and that there is nothing I can do about it, that it no longer troubles me. And so what is this relation that I'm making to the tantras? Well, in the tantras, the outer tantras, we talk about this level, this entry level, where the deity is seen to be superior and more important than oneself, external and superior. So we see God to be something real, sort of up in heaven, let's say, or over the crown of our head. The creator of the universe, who has this divine plan. And this is associated with this outer level of Tantra, where we see the deity to be superior and higher than oneself. And seeing the deity to be divine and supreme, then we don't question the will of God. And so this helps us greatly in coming to accept our suffering. Coming to accept the fact that we have suffered and also that we will suffer in future times. Now, really, for most people, a belief in karma, cause and effect is not significantly different from the belief in the will of God. Because once we accept that the reason why we suffer is because of our previous acts, the ones we committed in past lifetimes, then along with that, we don't reject our suffering. We accept our suffering. We're kind of open to it. And when you're open to something, then it's much easier to deal with. I'll just give you a really simple example. If somebody were to stab you, we'd find that very difficult, right? We'd call the police. We'd find it really painful. We wouldn't like it one bit. But when a surgeon or a doctor has to cut you open, then we accept that. The thought or the idea might be a little bit difficult, but because we know ultimately it's something beneficial to us, then we are accepting. And we even pay for this, right? We pay for surgery. We even pay for cosmetic surgery, right? We pay a lot of money for it, for somebody to cut us. But if a thief or a robber were to cut us, then we find that intolerable. And we might hang on to that trauma for the rest of our life. But after getting our facelift, we'll probably thank the surgeon, maybe even give him a tip. So what I'm saying here is it all has to do with your way of thinking. Now, although there are significant differences in the belief in karma, cause and effect, effectively, practically, for most people, it's pretty much the same as accepting the will of God. The important thing is that we no longer fight against our negative experience. We no longer resent or have bad feelings towards the negativities that have been perpetrated against us. In terms of God, then that's because we see it to be the will of God. And if we have a lot of faith, and we're able to accept anything. I mean, look at the story of Job, for example. He suffered greatly, but he never lost his faith in God. And that carried him through the hardship. And likewise, if you really do believe in karma, cause and effect, then you're going to think, well, of course they stole my money. You know, they robbed me, mistreated me. Of course they did, because in past lifetimes, I must have done the same to them. And so now we're even, and it can end there. It's very much the same thing, right? We think it's the will of God. Okay, I'm not going to take it any further. The thing doesn't get any worse. Now, this is a kind of provisional way of thinking about this topic. It's kind of mechanical. We're doing it merely to reduce our aversion, our resentment, to reduce the effect of that trauma or suffering. If we accept it, then it'd be okay. It won't harm us so much. But ultimately, understanding how everything is one with God, how everything is non-dual, how everything arises as a consequence of karma, to actually understand that is quite difficult. That's another level of practice. And it's very difficult to have that high level of practice. That's fine, we don't need that. The very foundation, the first thing we need to do is merely to accept our lot in life. And even if you're not a religious person, then there are ways to develop acceptance. Because in terms of the modern scientific paradigm, then we see things to be the consequences of a random series of events that stretches back to the Big Bang. And so in this way, we can see that there is no ultimate malevolent force in the universe who's trying to harm us, and that because of our genetics or because of the random mutations that have occurred and these kind of interactions within society, genetics, conditioning, environment, then we encounter difficulties, things that we don't like. But ultimately, there's nothing we can do about it. Now, of course, in the Buddha Dharma, then we don't teach that there's nothing you can do about it. The important point about karma is not that what you did in the past you can't change, and so you have to experience the consequences of that. The important point about karma is what you do now, because it is a consequence of your actions here and now, in this lifetime, that in future lifetimes you will experience well-being or suffering. And that's the important thing, because what matters is how we act now. For example, if I was wronged, and then I have great resentment because of that, then I do something illegal, I lash out, I try to get revenge, then that only propagates my own suffering, but it also makes the world a more difficult place. I mean, just look at the way people act these days, how polarized we are. Look at the behavior of modern politicians. It's like the truth doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is that we win and they lose. And this has made the world a really difficult and unpleasant place, and will only create further suffering and conflict in our societies and communities. So what the Buddha taught is, what matters is how you act here and now, and that's what you need to pay attention to. And so apply yourself to virtue. Admit when you're wrong. Admit the truth. Don't propagate lies. Don't act in a negative way just to get what you want, just to win. Everybody's doing that. It's made the world an intolerable place. So don't contribute to future negativity. Rather, apply yourself to virtue and sow the seeds of future happiness for yourself and others. And until next time, and see you later.